All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started. I'm Eric Orton, Boise State University, and I, among other things at Boise State, I manage our iTunes U platform, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done with some of the podcast projects on campus. And I'm going to talk a little bit about recorded lecture, but a lot more about what is beyond that, because I think a lot of the times we have lecture capture in 15 rooms on our campus, well actually 25 now, because we have 15 rooms of Echo 360, and we've added 10 rooms of Matterhorn, if you're familiar with that open source lecture capture system. That's growing, the Matterhorn leaps and bounds. And so there's a lot of lecture capture, and the first thing faculty think of with podcasting is often that, the ability to post that. And so, trying to get them to think a little bit more innovatively about how podcasting can be used is one of the things that we're doing. So my first few slides here are going to be kind of preaching to the choir a little bit. This is a modification of a presentation that I give from time to time to our faculty, and so many of them don't even know what a podcast is. So I'm just going to kind of introduce the concept. I apologize if this is something you know well, but just in case there's anybody here for whom this is kind of new, and then just at least this way you'll be able to see how I teach it to our faculty. So, audio and video on the web is nothing new. That's been something that we've been able to do for probably close to 15 years now, in some form or another. And so, what's new about podcasting is kind of a subscription model, that you can make things part of a series, then users can subscribe to that series, and it becomes kind of like TiVo, where it automatically comes to them as new things get posted, and they don't have to go back and keep re-accessing or re-downloading the latest things. So I compare it when I'm talking to our faculty, basically like TiVo or a TV show. And the term podcast, sometimes I think what gets confusing for faculty, and us as well, maybe from time to time, is what does the word podcast really mean? Because sometimes you say, when you say TV show, what does that really mean? My wife, she's been watching this show, I can't even remember what channel it's on, it's one of the reality TV, Extreme Couponing. It's on Wednesday nights, right? So if you ask her what's your favorite TV show, she might say Extreme Couponing. She doesn't mean one episode of Extreme Couponing, she means the whole thing. And somebody might use podcast in that sense, but if then you say, well, what are you doing right now? I'm listening to a podcast. You're not talking about, well, I'm listening to every episode ever. You're talking about one episode. And so that sort of, nomenclature, I guess, gets a little bit confusing. So sometimes it's used to refer to one, sometimes the other, but the salient feature, I guess, of a podcast is that it's a serialized type of a delivery of audio or video content online. And that has some implications for when we should use it. So I think of it kind of like setting up a bank draft, because it's something, again, that the end user can subscribe to, that they can receive automatic downloads of. So, why would you set up a bank draft? Well, to pay your mortgage, great, reason to set up a bank draft, right? It's kind of the same amount. It gets taken out on a fairly regular schedule. Buying your kids' school clothes, not such a good reason to set up an automatic bank draft. It's a variable amounts, although always way too much. And you do that once a year or whatever, kind of at different times. So it's just not really something you'd set up. So I encourage faculty to think about a podcast sort of in that way when they say, well, what would be the good of putting something on iTunes U versus putting it up on Blackboard? And I'll kind of say, well, you might put it up on Blackboard if it's a video introduction to your class. And the students are going to watch it once. It's not really part of a series. But if you're going to do like a test review that, every 2 weeks you have a quiz and you're going to put up a little podcast to review the important concepts before that quiz, that would be a great reason to use a podcast, because it's going to be regular serialized content that the students can then go subscribe once and automatically get downloads of that. But a lot of times I think faculty will use technology for one of two reasons. One is that we have a faculty member, and you may hear him later in this podcast or in this talk, Michael Blankenship at our university. He is a notorious techno lover. Anything that's kind of new and cool and shiny, he wants to do. And so that's one reason that sometimes our faculty engage in using new technologies. Another reason, and this is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, we have some faculty that are teaching on lecture capture systems, and I mentioned this a little bit at the start, who they just sort of see it as being, oh, it's easy. It's already being recorded. I can just slap it up on iTunes U. Never mind that it's an hour and a half long. Why not? It's easy to do that. So they get into it because it's easy. But what we, of course, try to coach them to do is think about why it is that you're doing it. Just because you can and just because it's, you know, it's new and you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that it makes sense for what it is that you're trying to do in your course. So think first about your learning objectives, then think of activities independent of any particular technology that are going to help to further those learning objectives. And then you look and say, is there a technology that either enables this activity or enables it to be done better, more efficiently, cheaper, whatever. And that's kind of why you know, we encourage faculty to use that. So a couple of studies cited here. This is about a physician named Michael Barrett. And he had a challenge in teaching medical students. He was teaching the sounds that they would hear when they auscultate or listen to the heart or the lungs, and the different sounds that they would hear and murmurs and so forth. And what he found is that they were able to identify, after they had had kind of the standard training where they, you know, go over in lecture what these things should sound like and stuff, correctly the sounds that they were listening to about 30% of the time. Does that sound great to you? Who wants a doctor that you know, 30% of the time gets it right? No, that's terrible, right? So he said, well, you know, I'm going to record all these sounds. I'm going to comment on them and what's being heard, and then I'm going to give the students a CD full of these audio files where I have actual examples of the sounds that they're hearing along with my commentary, and let them listen to those things over and over and over again, this repeated kind of thing. And the students fairly quickly looked and said, you know, this CD is kind of cumbersome. I can listen to it in my car, I can listen to it at home, but I don't want to do that. I want to listen to it running on the treadmill. So they just copied the files off the CD, stuck them on their iPods, and started listening that way. And nobody really cared until that had happened. You know, when he was doing the CDs and stuff, he published in some medical journals and things. Nobody really cared about that, even though his results were phenomenal. It raised their recognition rate from 30% to about 80%. Now that's phenomenal, right? Phenomenal learning. But you know, once they started doing it on their iPods, then it made the national media. Dr. iPod makes better, you know, heart doctors and so forth. So that quote there was just kind of a, you know, illustrative of what he did first is identify something that made sense to do for his learning objectives, which was this repetition of being able to hear these things. And then he found a technological way to do that that made sense. Okay, so we'll go right through that. So as far as lecture podcasting goes, and when I talk about lecture podcasting, I'm generally talking about a recording of an entire lecture. It's the kind of thing you'd get with lecture capture, or a faculty sitting in their office and saying, I'm going to just, you know, record this entire lecture and put it up online. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to sort of debunk if you haven't already been familiar with this research. One of the biggest fears when you talk to faculty about whether, you know, recording kind of, you know, podcasts for lectures, they say, but students will stop coming to class. Why would they come to class if, you know, if they can just watch it on their own time? And what the research shows is that they don't really do that. There was one study in all the studies that I looked at, one study where they actually did notice some drop in attendance. But by and large, they didn't. And you know, in reflecting on that and talking to our faculty about that, I think it's because there's a lot more that goes on in a typical lecture room than lecture. And there's opportunities for the students to engage in different kinds of activities. And that's something that they're going to miss when they don't show up to class, and they know that. And they're going to miss announcements and things like that. Often those can be recorded, but one of the strategies that one of the faculties in one of the studies did is actually took out some of the announcements and stuff from the podcast. So they got the content, but they didn't get the announcements, and it was kind of a, you know, come to class because you need the announcements. But, you know, I think that although that probably had some effect, you know, announcements and things like that are the very kinds of things that can be put in a podcast and you know, so that instructional time can be used a little bit more efficiently. So I'm not sure I would necessarily encourage that. But this is basically just to say, you know, it's not a big concern in actual practice. Faculty worry about it, but it doesn't generally play out. And if it did, I would kind of question whether or not the replacement of that lecture time would really be a good thing, right? I mean, if you can be replaced in what you do in the classroom by a recording, then why not replace you with a recording, right? But most faculty don't do you know, things that can be replaced by a recording solely in class. That said, you know, we'll talk about some ways that you might take advantage of that kind of thing further on in this presentation, in ways that replace certain aspects of what the faculty member does, but not the faculty member. And that's part of their fear, I think, is that I will be replaced by a piece of technology. And so there's, understandably a lot of resistance to that. But I think we can talk about some ways that faculty members can do more of what they really enjoy most about teaching using this kind of technology. So another issue is that students often underutilize these lecture recordings. It's an entire lecture. Some of your lecture capture systems now make it possible, many of them do, to jump around in the presentation to access particular pieces. Some of them are more or less easy to find exactly where it is that you want to jump, even when they have that random access. But the students are not going to generally listen to an entire lecture after the fact as a review, unless maybe they missed the lecture, the first time it was given. So one of the kind of things that I ask faculty members to think about is, if you do something, think about the end user. Are they going to consume it? It's worthless to do it if the end user isn't going to take advantage of what you've done. So are there more effective ways to provide review and stuff for people than just putting hour-long lectures up online? So, but there are some really good rationales for recording entire lectures. One example that was given by a community college in Wyoming, they had a radius for their college of about 100 miles. So, as far as where the students were coming from, a little over 100, maybe 120, I can't remember exactly. Big service area anyways. And through that service area were several kind of mountain ranges and passes that got snowed in the wintertime and so forth. And so they had sort of turned to lecture capture technology as a way of providing access to students who weren't going to get the access in other ways, for a variety of factors, not the least of which was weather at certain times of the year, just making it impossible for them to get to campus. So, when there's reasons that students need to be able to access content at a distance, lecture podcasting can be a great thing. And then, distance courses, obviously, where, you don't want it to just be read all the time. Some of the using lecture podcasts and stuff can provide some alternative presentations of content that are effective for students, give them a little sense of variety. But I guess before I talk about this slide, I'll kind of stop here to talk about the principle of the inverted classroom. Anybody familiar with that term, inverted classroom? Yes, Randy? So the idea of the inverted classroom is that in kind of traditional course instruction, what generally happens is students come to class, they get a lecture in which they go over simple cases that really help to illustrate the concepts and things like that, and sort of help them to understand, the basics on a fairly easy level of what's going on in the class. And then they get assigned homework. And what's in the homework? Harder problems than what they went over in class, right? And then they go home and they do those homework problems at home without the support of the instructor, without the support of their classmates often. And they, kind of have to struggle through that on their own. The idea of the inverted classroom is to say, rather than having them go home and do homework that is more difficult application independently, let's let them do the more difficult application with a support structure, with collaborative learning, with their professor there to answer questions and support them. And so you front the instruction that occurs in the classroom with podcast lectures that go over the easy examples. Thanks. Fair description, Randy? All right. So, the idea of the inverted classroom is another great use of kind of lecture podcast. You can also do shorter things, previewing upcoming lectures, demonstrating, and this would be particularly with video podcasts, lab procedures. So we've had some faculty that kind of record the steps of a lab or demonstrate safety procedures or things like that they would normally cover in class, and kind of the students come expected to already have reviewed that and know that, and that way they can just, again, it's kind of, getting some of the announcements, some of the demonstration, things that can be taken care of outside the period of the classroom, so that when the students come, we make the best use of the instructor's time and expertise doing things that can't really be covered in another way. And that's kind of where I'm getting at when I say, replacing aspects of what the instructor does with technology as opposed to replacing the instructor with technologies. Faculty members in here other than Randy, anybody? Yes, okay. So the two of you I want to pick on for a minute. What's your favorite part of teaching?
Getting to specific problems and dealing with more complex issues.
Okay. Anything you add in?
Seeing students, the light bulb go on when they're making the connection between what I'm talking about and what's going on in their world.
Okay. And when does that happen most?
Often in the discussion part of the class.
Right.
Sometimes I think I can read their mind, but they may be thinking, wow, that's a good idea for dinner.
Right.
But the discussion
Right.
part is where we can make that connection.
Right. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say, in talking to most of the faculty members I've talked to, the things that they enjoy most about teaching are the things that bring them into closest contact with the students. That's where they can really help somebody through some problems, see that light bulb go on, and kind of get that validation that comes from seeing the students succeeding in something. And so the idea behind what you can do with podcasting is that you can give faculty members more time to do that and less time just delivering the same content kind of over and over again in a way that they get fairly familiar with and used to, right? So it takes away maybe some of what, or can take away some of what's routine about teaching, and allow the faculty member to focus on the things that they can really only do in direct contact with students. Summaries we've already mentioned of key points for review, recording discussions with small groups of students that then they can put online for larger groups of students. So one faculty member, for example, would podcast office hours. Not so much one-on-one office hours, but maybe have a session where they said, here's a live session, you can come if you want at the live time. We're gonna meet in a small conference room or my office or whatever, so kind of whoever can come. And experience was that there would be a few students there, most not. And so, it was never really a space issue in terms of, well, we got way too many students to fit in the room. But they could record that and then put it up online as a podcast that then the other students could listen to. And in that session, what they're really doing is just kind of, for the students that are there, what questions do you have? And it's kind of the assumption that those questions are representative of the kinds of questions the rest of the students who aren't there are going to have. Another way I'll mention now, I think it might be later on in the slide, but a similar way of doing that can even work at a distance. There's a website that's called, I think, k7.net. Basically what it does is it gives you a phone number, and many of your campus phone systems can probably do this as well. I know ours does. I have my email, or my voicemail gets sent to my email as just a WAV file that I can listen to on my mobile device or a computer or whatever. And so a lot of your campus systems will be able to do that now. But one of our faculty members who teaches at a distance started doing this a couple years ago with this k7.net, I think before our phone systems could do that. And what it does is it creates a phone number. I think it's a Washington phone number. So it's long distance for our students, but since they're all using cell phones that have nationwide long distance, it doesn't really matter. And what they can do is they can call in, they leave a message, the faculty member gets it as an audio file, so they can call questions in, basically. And then what he does is he sort of figures out what are the most common or the most important questions, answers them, and he can put the student's voice and his response right in there in the same podcast. So this, the students get to sort of be part of that, and it becomes sort of like a radio call-in show, sort of a thing, or a review. So it, kind of just a neat way to use the technology. So answers to common questions, as we talked about here, and then we've talked a little bit already about kind of that inverted classroom model of putting the content that doesn't really involve interaction between the students and the professor, the students and each other, in that podcast to free class time up to work on those more interactive types of learning modalities. And announcements and administrative stuff we've talked about as well. Couple of more interesting things. There's actually podcasting now that's being used in online physical education classes. So the first time I heard of that, I kind of went, what? Online PE? How do you teach PE online? Well, the way that you teach PE online is you have podcasts that walk the students through how to do stuff. And it's sort of just like the audio version, I guess, of the workout videos or something, really. You kind of, it's stuff that they can do, that they can listen to the steps, that they can follow along with. And one very interesting, this came out of a webinar I participated in a while back, a professor had mentioned this, that he said one of the ways that he would use podcasting himself and that he would recommend to his students was an idea that was based on the way that Cicero used to memorize speeches. So he was, Cicero, Roman orator, very famous for his oratory. And what he would do is he would he would read the speech, and then as he would read it, he would walk a pre-planned route around the city, around Rome. And he would associate, as he did that, things in the speech with things that he saw. And he would read it kind of at a certain pace, so that he would begin to say, I associate this idea with this object that I see as I walk around the room. And then as he would give the speech, he would sort of mentally retrace his steps along that route, and he'd be able to remember sort of the next pieces of his speech. So the way that this faculty member would use this, and that he recommended to his students, is said, take a walk with your iPod on, listen to the content, and associate it with visual things that you see as you're going. And then that kind of ties those things together in your memory, and you can kind of use the power of the visual thing to kind of, again, mentally retrace your steps and recall things that, by association. So, any questions so far? I know I'm probably talking kind of fast.
He actually says, okay, now, where do you write down? Think about this and associate that with this topic.
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose he could. It'd certainly be a way of highlighting the importance of something, as opposed to the students having to guess what in this podcast is important, right? So yeah. Yeah. Only this one is, the things that I think the associations, what he was talking about, would be like, if I was walking the Greenbelt in Boise, one of the things that I might see is the backside of the Kevin Williams Sports Complex, the indoor football practice facility. And it may be that what I'm associating with that has nothing to do with football or sports, but it's just sort of when I see that Kevin Williams Sports Complex, I'm going to think about, the charges of, certain particles in chemistry or something like that and stuff. So, I think the association probably, the more that there could be something that you say, okay, well, I'm looking at something green, the idea that I'm talking about starts with G, or, has some, where there's some kind of an association there that's a little bit stronger, probably makes it more effective. But, yeah. Yep. Exactly. That's basically what this is a mnemonic device that takes advantage. Now, for some students, obviously, for students who sort of learn visually, this is going to be a more powerful tool than for students who, learn in some other way. But nonetheless, it's a very innovative way of thinking about how you can use podcasts, certainly. So, I neglected at the start of the presentation to sort of ask if, anybody at your institutions, are you doing things with podcasts?
We actually just got a Camtasia Relay grant.
Okay.
Site-wide license so that all of our instructors can use, and it's a full screen capture.
Right.
And we're having to send things to courses at I2.
Okay.
It has a private I2 site.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just wrapping up the pilot project at the end of the semester. So.
And is the way, I'm familiar with Camtasia from sort of the desktop side. Is the way that Camtasia Relay, because I don't know if that's actually boxes or that are in the classrooms or how that works, is that something that they could also record? Is the automatic kind of the posting?
We're using it right now.
Okay, so, and could it then automatically post from their computer to your iTunes U or whatever?
Well, you have to actually be on campus
Okay.
to publish it.
Right.
So if I was to go off-site and record a lecture, I have the recorder on a flash drive and save the file. And once I get back to the campus network,
Right.
then I plug it into my computer. It says, "Do you want to send this?" And then
Okay.
it shoots it right out.
So they can do, so it could be used to publish podcasts that they record in their office as well as lecture capture from
Yeah,
the
and we worked
classroom.
on another grant to try to get some mics in our classrooms so that they could record when they're doing a live
Right.
lecture and then make it available to their online students.
Okay.
And then our other piece is for the solely online, getting
Right.
that element of
Right. Right. So what you're doing now is actually more geared towards what they're doing in their office, and you're expanding it to the classroom instead of the other way around.
Our initial goal was to get lectures into online classes, but
Uh-huh.
also encourage the campus faculty to
Okay.
some of the reasons that you're talking about.
Yeah. Our path with lecture capture has been the reverse, so that's interesting, where it's kind of started as capture your classroom content,
Right.
and now we're using some of the personal capture technologies and stuff to say, capture something that you do as a short review at your desk or whatever. So yeah, that's great.
Let's see, last summer we rolled out a statewide implementation of integrity lecture capture.
Okay.
It's available to any student or any instructor in the system. It's cloud-based, it's integrated with our learning management system, and it can be used to do lecture capture in the classroom, to create lecture content to be viewed later.
Mm-hmm.
Students can do recordings, can be used in test proctoring centers. There's some pretty neat analytic tools where instructors can run reports to see what parts of the recording students are rewinding and watching over.
Okay.
So you could save your students before you come to class, watch these videos, and then in class we'll concentrate on the stuff that
Right.
trouble with. You can use it either way.
Right. So brings me to an interesting idea, because one of the things that faculty members will, and Randy, I'm sure you'll probably weigh in on this, with the inverted classroom approach. You know, a lot of faculty members, you present that to them and say, you know, what about doing it this way? And they'll kind of say, that sounds great, but how do I know that my students will come prepared? If I depend on them to have watched the podcast before they come, and then they don't, then all of the stuff that I plan for the classroom is not going to work out too good because the students haven't come prepared. Has that been?
Yeah, I mean, so some of the issues we had with Blackboard initially is that students had varying levels of access to things that we were hoping they'd walk into the classroom, having already done, an assignment that was put up on Blackboard, and it could just be them, or it could be they're not getting a signal, and that could create problems right at the beginning of class. So, good idea on paper, whatever the new version paper is.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's sort of conquering that with using Google, creating classroom stuff out of it, and no paper class, and 10 minutes before class time, I send them what we're covering in that day, because none of them do homework. Okay, I tried sending it for homework.
Right.
Okay, so for the first 10 or 15 minutes while we're goofing around trying to get it going, they're going, oh, I'm going over the homework I missed. So it's sort of a backwards way of getting them to cooperate, but it works.
Yeah. Yes.
One thing that I found really interesting talking to instructors, and now that I'm no longer in the classroom, I feel like I have this big blind spot. But talking to instructors, one thing that surprised me is they're using the lecture capture tool a lot more to get feedback from students and provide feedback to students on work that was turned in, not so much strictly just I'm going to take the information, give it to you,
Right.
like a two-way communication.
We actually have an instructor who, she uses the tablet PC, and when she's demonstrating math problems, she writes on it and provides those. And then when students turn in their homework, because of the math class, some of them, they're doing it all on paper, then they take a shot with their cell phone, and they email it to her, and then she writes on it with her tablet PC, and makes a recording of it and sends it back to them. So
Yeah.
it's pretty cool.
Yeah, there's some really good ways to do feedback
And
using
that's all online for
using
online
audio,
courses,
video.
so.
Yeah. Yeah, there's great uses of technology for feedback and kind of interaction with students in that way. You know, the thing that I often tell the faculty members when that concern comes up, and it feels kind of harsh to them, I guess, at first, or they kind of go, well, but I don't like to see that happen. Generally, in my experience, when people will sort of stick to their guns and say, you know, this is, you know, what I expect you to have done before you come to class, and this is why you need to have done it, and what the results are going to be if you don't. And then the students don't come to class having prepared that, and you just kind of move right on as if they did and let them fall on their face. 2 or 3 times of that at best, maybe generally once. And a lot of the students, I mean, there will always be the outliers, but most of the students will go, oh yeah, he meant it, or she meant it. And you know, proceed. So I mean, there's a learning curve for the students as well as for the faculty to deliver instruction and that kind of thing, but they can get it, you know, as far as kind of, you know, what the mode of learning in this class is going to be when it's flipped on its end like that. So I wanted to play for you, and I don't have any speakers here, but I'm hoping that I can just, I can actually, if I need to, disconnect the iPad and bring it closer, but I wanted to play for you at least a couple of examples of some of the, these are podcasts that some faculty who have been working in podcasting at Boise State recorded to present to their colleagues what it is that they found valuable about podcasting. Let's see, I'm going to play for you, we'll play at least Nere's, and then we'll see where we go from there. So I'm going to kick over here to... Oh, stink. Okay, I did a dumb thing. So I'm going to kick back and I'll just have to explain to you what they did. So who can guess what dumb thing I did? I synced my iPad after I listened to the podcasts and made sure which ones I wanted to use. Since they'd already been listened to, now they're not on here anymore. Oops. So I'll just kind of tell you what these faculty members were doing, give you some idea of what they found valuable. So Neri Lete, she teaches Basque language at Boise State, and the big challenge for her is that they just don't have textbooks in Basque. Not just don't have good textbooks, there just really isn't textbooks in Basque. And so, you know, whereas a lot of the publishers and things will have CDs and stuff like that that, you know, kind of have media on them and stuff that the teachers can use. Neri had nothing, so she recorded her own, and she gives the students listening comprehension exercises that they, you know, download by podcast, answer questions, and then, you know, return the answers to her. She does vocabulary reviews with them. It's an opportunity for them to hear native Basque speech and for them to be able to listen and respond to that. She'll do some things where they have to download a file which is presented as a podcast, then they have to use Audacity to record a response, which they send back up to her and stuff so she can critique that. So the assignment is delivered as a podcast. Their response, obviously, although it's an audio file, is not a podcast. But it gives her a lot of opportunity to do some things in teaching online as well as to supplement face-to-face instruction, because she teaches both ways. That are just, you know, giving the students some opportunities that they don't have. Otherwise, all they would have is what she does in class. Chris Haskell and Barbara Schroeder, they teach educational technology to students who are pre-service teachers, getting ready to teach in K-12, and kind of, you know, teaching them about things like blogs and wikis and, you know, how can you use these things to do classroom projects and things like that. And what they actually did with their podcasting is reaching out to the community. And so they kind of recognizing that, you know, there's a lot of teachers already teaching in K-12 who could learn from and benefit from this stuff. And so they came to me and said, we'd like to do a podcast on iTunes U, only not directed at our students, directed at K-12 teachers in the community. Would that be okay? Yes, absolutely, that would be wonderful. So we have that up there, and they you know, can listen to that and learn. And then they also use that same podcast as for assignments for their students. Michael Blankenship, I mentioned already, he's the notorious tech lover, one of those at our campus who's on the bleeding edge of everything, sometimes further out than we are in academic technologies. And then he comes and says, hey, I started playing with this thing and I broke it. Can you help me get it right? And we're going, I've never even heard of that thing, Michael, but we'll try. You know, he's doing stuff like reviews of current court cases and things like that that are around the issues that he's teaching about. kind of current events related to his discipline. He's in criminal justice. And Carrie Rice is another one in educational technology, and one of the ones that does the kind of phone-in kinds of question reviews. So then a lot of these, and this has already been mentioned a little bit here in terms of the students producing podcast work. So there's, if you listen to actually the podcasts that our faculty created, I would say 2/3 of them are probably talking about ways that, not necessarily that they use podcasting, or in addition to ways they use podcasting, things that they had students do to create podcasting and why they had the students do those things. So there are two at least. One of the things that you kind of think about when you're dealing with student-created podcast is the idea of cognitive load. Who's familiar with the term cognitive load? Ed, you want to explain what that is?
Well, you just basically give them more information and more information and more information, and they can only absorb so much
Right.
In the process of
And some of that information is wholly unrelated to the content that you're trying to teach them, right? So I think of kind of cognitive load in this particular context in sort of like, imagine a student's taking an online class, and they've never used Blackboard or Moodle or whatever it is that you're using before, right? So there's a whole lot to learn about just how do you interact with the course management system, how do you upload your assignments, how do you access materials, all of which is sort of necessary to get them to the point where they're interacting with the content and doing those things that are going to help them meet your learning goals. So there's a kind of a whole realm of stuff in the way of getting to the actual, activities that are directly aligned with your learning objectives. We want to minimize that, obviously, and sometimes we can't get around it. If somebody's taking an online course, learning that stuff is just kind of necessary. We can make it as easy as possible on them to get over that hump, but we can't get rid of the hump. I think sometimes faculty members doing student-created podcasts just get excited about the medium, and they assign all this stuff. Students do this, and they're going to create that, and they're going to make these wonderful video episodes, and about their content and stuff. But you teach a chemistry class, right? So that becomes cognitive load. It's a bunch of stuff that they have to get through, and they have to learn how to podcast. Well, if podcasting is not part of the core objectives of your class, then you want to make sure. So you have to kind of ask yourself, does this make sense for the students to be doing this? What is the value to them of doing the podcasting? And I'll give you an example that I really, really wish I could play for you from one of our faculty in English who talks about what it is that the value was for his class. But definitely it would be useful if oral presentation is important, public speaking, for example, more foreign language, as we've talked about, or language learning at all, would be useful for, I guess, ELL, which is foreign language to them who are involved in learning it, right, English language learners. Or if technical competence in podcasting is an important part of the learning objective. So you can think about some communication classes, for example, where podcasting is what you're trying to teach, or at least it's very directly related to it. So, obviously those things make sense. Again, I'm not going to stand up here and say don't have students podcast unless you happen to teach radio production or foreign language or something else. But the principle is, think about what it is that you expect them to get out of the fact that they're doing a podcast, and make sure that the value that they're going to get out of doing that podcast is greater than the effort that they're going to have to learn to put into learning how to do a podcast. Because I think sometimes we in the educational technology fields love to talk about digital natives and millennial learners and other terms that we sort of come to say, these students already come here with all these skill sets and they know how to do all this stuff, and they're just so immersed in technology all the time that that this is going to be no problem for them. And they are immersed in technology all the time as consumers. But many of them are not producers. Some are, some aren't. And you'll find that if you just say, oh, but my students are already learning how to do podcasts. One of our faculty members in communication said one of the things that she was surprised about in sort of reflecting on her project is how few students even knew what a podcast was when she started her project. She had to sort of explain to them this is what a podcast is and give them some examples go listen to this, subscribe to one of these, you'll kind of see how this thing works. This is how to access these things through iTunes U and so forth. So you know, there's sometimes is an assumption that this is a medium they're familiar with, and that's not a safe assumption to make. So you think about, again, what's the value to them of doing the podcast, and is it really worth it for what they're going to get out of it? If it is, then you know, then it's a great medium to work with. So some things that professors have done is have students work in groups. So they, you know, have given a lecture, and one professor had, you know, small groups of students, each of whom were assigned to 1 week of the class. And their assignment was basically, you produce a short review of everything that you think was the most valuable, the most important concepts or points to come out of the class instruction for this week. And then the students sit down and they produce that. And then she posts that up there for the students to download and listen to. And it's a review for them, preparing for tests and exams and stuff. But it's also sort of a gut check for the professor, as in, you know, she may listen to the review and go, wow, that really isn't the key points that I would have put down in there. But that's what they thought the key points were, right? So it's sort of, it again is sort of that, now we have almost a dialogue going on between the students and the professor in a certain way. That she can hear what they thought were the key points of her lecture. And then she can respond if she needs to highlight some things that they may have missed that she thought were important. Public service announcements, reviews, sometimes having students listen to each other's work in podcasting and comment on that. One thing that I will say in regard to this with student-created podcasts too is you really have to be careful, I think, about what you require out of students with regard to production value. So it's great when students, you know, create this thing that has a stinger at the front and an outro, and they've got background music underneath, and the audio sounds great. But you know, often what you're going to get is a student who pressed record, they press stop at the end, they somehow managed to figure out how to save it as an MP3 file. There was a dog barking in the background, or an air conditioner humming the whole time. And so do you dock them for that, right? My response would be no, not unless production value is part of the learning objectives you're trying to teach. Now, if the dog's barking so loud or the air conditioner's humming so bad that you can't even hear what they have to say, then there may be some, you know, some things you have to say about that. But by and large, I would say for student-produced podcasts, focus on the content, right? If the content's good, the production value shouldn't really matter.
Eric?
Yes?
Those are expectations that in fact they would have to explain
Yeah.
to their students and let them know
Right.
the needs specifically to be successful with.
Right. And you know, I explain these concepts also to the faculty, because another thing too is editing audio is, I mean, they hire people whose whole job, and they get paid big bucks to do it, is just to make audio sound perfect. And faculty members sometimes have that expectation of themselves. So they sit at their computer and they record this thing and they say, I don't like what how it sounded like. And they do another take of it, and then they're like, oh, I said the P too hard a little bit here. I'm going to try. Some of them, like Michael Blankenship, will actually say, I think I can figure out how to edit that out or reduce the, this, and they start playing with all these tools like noise reduction and normalization and, things like that. And I tell them, you know what, if the students can understand you, that's all they're going to care about, really. They're focused on the content too. So, and that's not to say that production value has no value, but what I'm trying to tell the faculty is you can spend hours chasing down minute imperfections in your recordings that students are going to glaze right over and not even notice. And if they do notice, they're not going to care. So don't waste your time on that. Waste your time, not waste your time, spend your time on producing good content that delivers, the type of content that students need in the way that's going to be most effective for them to learn it. And production value should only be worried about insofar as it interferes with that. That's my opinion. Now, if you're producing something that's going on, your department's website that's meant for prospective students, it's a marketing piece for the university, that's different. But when you're talking about course content,
one thing I always try to encourage, we get a lot of faculty that come in to record a PowerPoint, and I always say, print off your notes for your slides and use those as a script.
right.
So that you're not, because we had one
Yeah, that's a
Letting
good.
them know before they record, you really should have a script.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I also do tell them, you know, stay out of rooms where the dog barks and the air conditioner hums. Try to get the environment nice, you know, as far as in pre-production. But what I'm trying to steer them away from is wasting a lot of time on post-production.
Right.
And I've also done it the other way around. I've talked to students about, or I should say talking to faculty about talking to students about the students not necessarily killing themselves because it's not necessarily a part of the grade.
Right.
But at the same time, trying to come up with some basic good practices about, say, using an external microphone or having
Sure.
knee closed and things like that.
Yeah, sure. So Bruce Ballinger, he's the one that I wanted to mention. He teaches creative writing. And so, you know, oral production really wasn't a direct part of what it is that he does. He's certainly not teaching podcasting as a medium, really. But he said it's different when students hear their work being read. It changes the way that they view their writing. And so the value that he found in it was that, you know, students, a lot of his students recognized that sort of the way that they were writing, you know, it was really, they would read over it and then hear it in their heads, and they would think that it, you know, sounded a certain way. They kind of got a voice in their head, and then they would actually record it and they'd listen to it and say, that sounded nothing like what I thought it was going to sound like. And it changed the way that they wrote. And so, you know, that's an example, I think, of saying what is it that what's the value that the students are supposed to get out of this? Is it worth it to their writing? His students were producing podcasts, and some of their creative writing, you know, ultimately may end up as podcasts. So it's not as if, like if the medium had nothing to do with what it is he was teaching. But he wasn't trying to make radio, you know, writers out of them or something like that. But there was a lot of value for him, enough value that he said it's worth it for them to have to learn how to use Audacity a little bit in order to improve their writing. The impact on their writing is going to be greater than the headache of learning Audacity. And he found that that was true, and the students reported to him that, you know, we really like having our work read. One of the things that I talked to him about, he hasn't done it yet. Right after he did his project, he's been on sabbatical. So I'm waiting for him to kind of get back off sabbatical. And what I want to have him do next, if I can talk him into it, is the students the first time around were writing and producing their own work. They were reading their own pieces and listening to it, and even then discovered many times that they didn't sound on, you know, in recording how they sounded in their heads. And it would change the way that they write. Now what I'd like to do is say, Bruce, what if you had the students record each other's work? What might they learn there? Somebody else reading their work, you know, and how that sounds in audio and how that impacts their writing. So we'll see. Any questions up to this point? So the last few things I want to talk about are just kind of some suggestions for format based on what some of the research says about student consumption and so forth. And then also some of the kind of gotchas or cautions that I would mention, some of which we've already talked about. But one thing, interestingly, even when you give students video podcasts, overwhelmingly, if they're given a choice, they almost always go with the audio. I have some theories, none of which are tested as to why that is. One of which is I think that they're multitasking, and I mentioned that also with the second point, which is that overwhelmingly, they like to listen on computers as opposed to transferring them to their mobile devices. So even though the podcast medium, you sort of say, well, you know, iPod, podcast, come on, you know, use this as you're walking across campus, use it as you're running on a treadmill. Some do, especially students in programs that are just very intense. I mean, I mentioned the medical students earlier, where it's sort of like any little piece of time that you can carve out to work on some stuff like that just is important to get you through medical school. Some of the students don't necessarily, you know, do things that way. And I think it's probably partly because of multitasking. I'm listening to the podcast as I'm working on my paper. I'm doing that at my computer. Another thing that I think factors into it is that these devices are for entertainment still in a lot of students' minds, whereas the computer is a device that's used for work and education. And so there's, but that barrier is starting to break down. There also was a day, you know, which I think has, you know, it's not completely gone, but it's passing very fast, when students hated their professors to be on Facebook. and to use Facebook in education. You know, I talked to several professors, let's say even as, you know, as 2 years ago, and I would say, and one of our psychology professors was, you know, trying some things with using Facebook, not as a required even component of his course or something, but as an option for students. And I said, how's that going, Eric? His name's Eric Landrum, and he said, it's kind of mixed. 50% of the students like it, but at least 50% of them really don't. They don't want me in there. That's their space. That's their social space. Some things have happened there with regard to both kind of evolution of the capabilities of Facebook as well as I think student attitudes that I would say it's different now. 2 years later, it's not quite that, you know, that way. The students tend to, you know, many of them actually like it when they are getting content through those tools that they're already spending so much time on. Would you have any experience to speak to that?
About that tonight.
All right. So we'll hear from Randy tonight about that. I won't steal his thunder. I think these devices have kind of followed a little bit of the same trajectory. They're starting to get more accepted as far as education, but they're still viewed, I think, in many ways as entertainment tools. And I think that's part of what feeds into that, working on a computer or listening on a computer. Lengthwise, keep them short, 6 to 10 minutes. Over 70% of the students said that they wouldn't want a podcast to go any longer than 15 minutes. That probably shouldn't come as a surprise. They, you know, again, you know, in the classroom, students are there for, you know, the better part of an hour, but it's not just nonstop talking. There's, you know, things that happen in the classroom to sort of break that up, give them a little brain break and an ability to sort of change focus for a little bit, get their attention back into what they're doing and things like that. And I think sometimes faculty members forget about that when they record lectures that are long. And then they forget that, you know, the same things that help the students to sort of break up that need to, you know, focus for that length of time in the classroom don't occur when you're talking about a podcast, so you have to keep them short. So some of the benefits, these shouldn't be, you know, a surprise to anybody. We've kind of talked about these things here. The only one maybe we hadn't mentioned yet is student satisfaction. Last thing, yes, Brandon.
Talk about, a little bit about the value for ESL students.
Yeah, so it's basically the same. We're taking this thing all over the place. Come on. Well, I'll leave it on that slide so that I don't, and still say about ESL students. So it's, I mean, it's really no different than for, you know, foreign language learning. Like I said earlier, the, you know, foreign language, I mean, this is, so for ESL, those who are learning English, it's just like if I'm trying to learn Russian or something like that, you know, being able to hear native speech and things like that are, you know, it's important to my learning as, you know, if I'm trying to learn Russian, it's important that they're learning if they're trying to learn English. But as far as ESL students who are learning, you know, chemistry or geology or, you know, sociology or what have you, you know, there's plenty of research out there to say the more channels I give somebody to, you know, experience the content is, the more likely it is that they're going to be able to latch onto one of those, and it's going to help them. So, you know, being able to listen to the content for some students is easier than having to read it. And so, when they, you know, they have a textbook and they're expected to do readings and stuff, and that's fine. Some of them will learn better that way. You know, they find it easier to read. But for some students, you know, when they really get it is when they're able to hear it. And that's, you know, that can be, you know, a benefit to the student whose native language is something other than English. So, does that answer your question, Randy? So the cautions here, as I've already mentioned, don't assume that students are familiar with the medium. Give plenty of examples, give directions on what you expect them to do. The second one I think is particularly important. What happens, you know, sometimes with, you know, somebody who's trying to do an inverted classroom approach, for example, is that they say, okay, well, I have this homework. I want to, you know, spend more time doing interactive, collaborative learning. So I'm going to give them a bunch of, you know, content outside of class that I need them to access and go through before they come to class as a podcast. And then they come to class. But the homework then doesn't really diminish much. And so what you end up with is a course and a half. So the caution to be aware of is, you know, some faculty members, when they figure out how easy it is to make podcasts, because it's really not that hard, so they say, well, that's great, I can podcast this, I can podcast that, and they don't replace anything with the podcast, they just pile it on top. And the danger then is that what you end up having is a class that's you know, far too rigorous for the course, you know, the credit load that it's supposed to carry. And so, you know, kind of being aware of that and saying if your course is already at an appropriate level of rigor, if you're going to add a podcast in, perhaps, you know, a supplementary podcast to help those who are struggling or something would be about the only reason when you wouldn't maybe replace something that's already there with that podcast. You got to pay attention to what the workload is in total for the students. Then accessibility is kind of the last consideration that often doesn't get noticed, you know, by people. And again, it's a little bit, the rules become a little bit different if what you're talking about is an alternative form. Podcasting is one way of getting this content. There's already, it's in addition to or a supplement to other ways already in there for getting the same content, just kind of to give students, again, multiple channels to access that content and they can kind of pick. That's one scenario. But often what would happen then is the podcast is the channel for that particular piece of content. And if you have a student who's hearing impaired, for example, and there's no other alternative, that can land the, you know, faculty member in a kind of a bind, because ultimately they're going to have the legal obligation to deliver that content in a way that's accessible to all of their students. And they can't necessarily predict ahead of time, you know, whether they're going to have a student who's deaf or whatever in the course. And that's another benefit of what you said earlier, which is the scripts. If they have a script and they used a script in the production of the podcast, then they have that for students who aren't able to hear the podcast. Well, here's the script, you know, the transcript of what I said. So the thing that I kind of tell faculty is the principle of universal design, if you're familiar with that term, is that you design things in a way that is useful to everyone and that gives multiple options for accessing the content. And often the features that you built in thinking this is going to help a deaf student ends up helping a student who can hear because they just prefer to learn that way or because of other factors. Think of it sort of as, you know, you have the blue buttons on all your buildings that you can, you know, hit the button to open the door. And what's the last time that you were doing this? Kick, you know, and carried your big heavy box of books or whatever through the door. You say that wasn't designed for somebody carrying a box of books, it was designed for someone in a wheelchair. But yet it works for the person carrying the box of books. So same idea with universal design. But faculty members will say, yeah, but universal design's a lot of work. You know, it is a lot of work. And so I don't necessarily tell people you have to do universal design from the start. But I will tell people you better have a plan for accessibility so that when the need arises, you know that you can meet the need without having a really undue burden, you know, placed on you at a point where you say, hey, I've got all these wonderful recorded lectures, I have no transcript of any of them, and now I have to listen to them and transcribe them all, and I have no TA and no research assistants and nobody to do it but me, and I've still got to grade all this stuff, and I've still got to teach my class, and I've still got to do my research. And, you know, so you at least need to think about how will you meet the need, whether that's already there from the start or whether you just have a plan for doing it should the need arise.
I was going to say, we have Camtasia Studio, and you can use Relay to publish things in Studio. So Studio has the ability to import text and transcripts. It's much better to be proactive than reactive.
Right. And that's the
having to redesign everything to accommodate one student rather than just designing it from the get-go.
So I've got a whole list here, and if anyone wants these slides, I can send them to you of research. I'm flipping them through this real quick just to show you that it's not just me who's been looking into this stuff. But any questions that I can answer here at the end? Yes, Scott?
I appreciate that your session was about educational philosophy here and not the nuts and bolts. But for our newbie, could you just quickly give us a look at what tool you're going to record something as an MP3? How does this get posted so that the student can download it on their iPod?
Okay, so the tool that I would recommend that you use is called Audacity. Audacity.sourceforge.net. To go there and download that.
Is that like Windows and Mac?
It's Windows, Mac, and Linux even. Yeah. So that's a free piece of software. It's open source, very powerful. You can export MP3 out of that. If you use the stable release, which is 1.2.7, I believe on PC at least, and I can't remember the new numbering for Mac, you have to go download this separate little plugin called Lame in order to export to MP3, but the instructions are all there on the website of what you need. If you download the beta, I found that the beta is actually very stable. I recommend that, and that exports to MP3 natively. As far as the upload, it depends on where you're putting the content and how you're getting it up there. So if you use Audacity, Audacity is not going to manage the upload for you. If you use something like Echo 360 Personal Capture or the Camtasia stuff that you've got, the Camtasia Relay, you can configure that so that it automatically will upload it to, to your iTunes U or whatever. But, or, Blackboard, I don't know if Camtasia Relay goes to Blackboard. I know Echo 360 will post to Blackboard automatically. But the upload process, once somebody has a iTunes U page, and your institution would have to have an iTunes U site to do that, is basically they log into, they navigate to their page in iTunes U. There's a little link for upload and manage content. They click that, they click add a file, browse to where the MP3 is on their computer, upload it. It's very easy.
Sure, an interesting thing we encountered when setting up our iTunes U site, most of our faculty were concerned about public access. Are other people going to be able to go to iTunes U and search for my class? Because they were not necessarily wanting to do that. And so LC is currently private. You can't go and search for Lewis Clark State College and get anything. What we found from an administrative standpoint, that was kind of unfortunate because in order to give them access to do their own uploading and downloading and editing, they would have access to everyone's stuff. They would all basically have administrative access, and we said, yeah, we're not doing that. So that kind of created an extra workload for myself and the other people in my department because they have to email us and say, look, I want that deleted. I didn't mean for that to get out there. So it's one thing to be just to be aware if your institution doesn't currently have an iTunes U site, that if it's private, someone's probably going to have to manage it for the faculty unless you're okay with every faculty member having administrative access to everyone's stuff.
Yeah. It depends on how your system works. I built a database for our system where I can put in faculty members to give them credentials to particular pages so that they can log in and edit. But what I can't do is pull that out of the enterprise system, unfortunately, so we're a PeopleSoft campus, and I can't get the information out of PeopleSoft. I would love it if I could just say, hey, you log in, PeopleSoft tells me what classes you're an instructor in, and I automatically grant you the appropriate access to those courses. Since I have to manage it myself, as far as explicitly going into our database and granting them those permissions, one thing that I've done, some of the faculty members will say, can I have my students upload podcasts to my class? And I say, no, they have to give it to you, and then you have to upload it, because I'm not going to sit and enter in manually into that database all those numbers of students. But.
Hey, Eric, I'm going to have to cut questions off right now because of the...
Yeah, we need to get the time to switch. Ed is in your next, so he wants his time.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm just kidding. So, before I share this with Eric, this is a presenter's gift for all of you people who have not been here before. Presenter's gifts are really nice. Notice how cleverly wrapped it is and how nicely designed by somebody. You too could be having a presenter's gift.
It's too small for an iPad, is it?
It's heavy. It's heavy.
Oh, okay.
But, so Eric, thank you very much for your presentation and for the time that you put into this presentation. It does take a lot of time. You can tell it's a low-key group, very easy. It's not intimidating to do presentations, so please do them in the future. But there's effort goes into them, and we appreciate you doing that.
That's it.
For having that session. I also want to point out, as a spokesperson, that vendors are set up outside during the break period. So please feel free to engage with them and talk with them. And of course, the break is also here. Good time to follow up with Eric if you have other specific questions. So I hate to cut that off.
Nope. That's okay. I was planning on making that the last one anyway, because I know you need to get set up.
Yeah, well, I need to go to the bathroom too, so more important.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.